Well, hello, everybody. Hello. Happy Easter. Happy Resurrection Day. It's a good day, isn't it? It's a good day. You know, in first service, Pastor Mike introduced me, and beforehand he said something along the line of, these are good messages, no pressure, and I thought, uh-oh. And then in the prayer today, this service, he said, help Jim with these amazing messages. And I'm thinking, again with the pressure. What if it's not an amazing message? What if it's a horrible message? I hope it's not. So I want to give you a slice. This is a view of how I'm thinking about this message, okay? There was a story of two guys. They died and they went to heaven. Peter meets them at the gate. One man who died was a taxi driver. One man who died was a preacher. Remember, this is going to be a slice in my mind right now. So they're there, and Peter meets them, this taxi driver and this preacher, and he said, "Oh, I'm so glad you're here, guys. We've been looking forward to seeing you. We've got houses prepared for you. It's going to be a great time. So let me take you to your homes." And the two fellows think, hey, this is good. So they go together, and they stop at this immense, this ginormous house, this mansion. And it's got a pool and a golf course in the backyard and hot tubs, and it's sprawly and spacious, and it's just immense. It's very, very nice home. And Peter looks at the taxi driver and he said, "This is for you." And the taxi driver, he's feeling very good about things. And the preacher says, "Well, what about me? Where's my house? What do I get?" And Peter said, "Well, that's you next door." And the preacher looks over, and there's this little itty-bitty house. And it's dilapidated, mismatched materials on the outside. It's kind of leaning over. It's kind of a lean-to type house, a little itty-bitty lot. And the preacher looks and he said, "Why do I get such a small little house?" And Peter said, "Well, when you preached, people slept. But when the taxi driver drove, people prayed." That was funny, right? That's a slice. Don't let me get a lean-to. Okay? I hope that I don't know. This is a great day for us as believers. This is a day, regardless of the message and regardless of what goes on, we can think, he rose. He rose. This is I share this, and I'll tell anybody out there, this is my favorite day to remember as a believer. We've got all kinds of holidays. There's good holidays. Christmas is a nice day. He was born. I like Yom Kippur. It's a day that reminds me of forgiveness. There's these different days of remembrance. But this day to me is special. This is the resurrection day. It's a good day. I'm just curious, before I really get rolling, how many of you have Easter traditions? Or you had them maybe as children, something like that? Some of you. I'm going to share some. Pastor Mike went on a covert mission for me, and he was able to do some investigating and ask some of you what your Easter traditions were. And I think he did this on Facebook, and he did some in other ways. So these are what some of the things folks said. "For as long as I can remember, my dad would get both my mom and me an orchid corsage to wear on Easter dresses," which is very nice. I never did that. I feel like a very bad man. What a nice thing. Did anybody ever do that? Do you have a family where maybe your parents got you corsages for Easter? No? Resurrection Day? New dresses and new shoes. When we were younger, it included a new hat and gloves. I bought my shoes today. So I like this because it's somebody, even after these years, who still remembers, right? They still remember that tradition. New clothes and shoes as a kid, and an Easter basket. My grandmother always baked a red velvet cake in the shape of a cross. Big dinner after church Sunday afternoon, ham, fried chicken, some sort of seafood, potato salad, macaroni and cheese, several salads, pecan pie, lemon meringue pie, watermelon. You need lunch to get through the list. My grandfather always made homemade ice cream in the old-time crank bucket maker. It was a big to-do, lots of family. How many of you have never seen those old-time ice cream makers? Is there anybody? We would take these buckets, they had a crank inside, so you put the ingredients in. And at first it was fun to do. And then you realize you got a long way to go, and you would earn that ice cream. So whatever calories you put on from the ice cream, you burn it off beforehand. I don't think it's a reason people don't use those anymore. I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence that they don't use them anymore. There was an obligatory dress like your sister, wear patent leather shoes, and a straw hat with a ribbon down the back. The purpose of said ribbon was to make you believe the boy sitting behind you in church was yanking on it every time you sat back in a pew. As a boy, yep, I probably would have did that. Of course he was not. And then there was a mad dash to find your Easter basket behind the couch. Afterwards, you were brought to Nana's and pose for awkward pictures, eat cold ham and potato salad, and be repeatedly told to stop touching that. My favorite one, I love to bite all the heads off my sisters' and brothers' marshmallow chicks and put them back in their Easter baskets. That's my kind of kid. Easter is a great day. It's just a celebration day, a resurrection day. It's a day to remember, and it's a day we think of all of the things that God did and how it went and how it ended. And there's a quote from C.S. Lewis, and I want to read it so I make sure I get this quote right. He said, rather than hearing new ideas, sometimes we need to be reminded of old truths. Today, Resurrection Day, it screams of remembering the old truth in that. The old truth. And looking at the old truth. It's just a wonderful day. So this picture is just of a tomb in Israel. There are two places in Israel that they think that Jesus' body may have been buried in, and this is one of them. It's called the Garden Tomb. It's outside, and if you see the bricks next to the door, if you keep going down that way, maybe a couple hundred yards, there is a hill, and on that hill you can see the shape of a skull. And it's fairly pronounced. Part of this just broke off, which is sad, but you can still see this shape of a skull. And it's really powerful, and there's a lot of people who think that that's where, the Bible talks about the place of the skull, they think that's where it was, and that the tomb was outside, and this does meet the biblical qualifications of where he could have been buried. And inside, it's actually quite a little doorway, and inside is a small little space, and there's like a sitting area, and then there's an area they would have put his body. And on the outside, and it's very difficult to see, right in front of the step, there's actually a trench in front of that doorway, and it's probably about this wide, and that's where a big stone at that time would have been rolled like a stone trough, like a guide for a stone, to roll in front of that doorway. So it's a very cool visual for what may have been. Now there's another tomb that a lot of people suspect could have been the place that his body was buried, and it's inside of a church now. Years ago in Israel, they had this tomb outside, and they chipped the whole tomb away from the rock that it was in, and they moved it a bit, and they built a great big church around it. And the church is called Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It's old, and I didn't want to show a picture of it. It's it's actually very depressing. It's very dark. There's a lot of incense that hangs from the ceiling in this tomb, and the smoke from the incense has just darkened this tomb, and it's very dismal. It's actually a very depressing atmosphere. But I noticed in that tomb, in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and in this tomb, I couldn't help but notice that there's no body there. That's the power of the resurrection. We really don't care all that much where he was buried, do we? He was only there for a few days. How many of you have stayed in different hotels and you don't remember all the hotels you've stayed in? You get what I'm talking about? The tomb was a hotel for the body. In, out. And I think of this empty tomb and I think, it's the empty that I love. It's not the body that I want to see in it, it's the empty. So this is the time, this is the day that we look at this event, and we declare it. We declare it as believers, of course, we believe that he did in fact rise from the dead. There are people all over the world that say, no, he didn't rise from the dead. Maybe you're sitting here, maybe you are sitting here and you're thinking, gee, I wonder if he did rise from the dead. We know that he rose from the dead. We can prove that he rose from the dead. History works with us that he rose from the dead. It's amazing, and we don't have time to do this, but there are scholars and historians from those times, all the way through to modern times, that didn't believe he was a son of God, but they believed he rose from the dead. I have no idea how that's possible. If you think somebody rose himself from the dead, that should be an attention getter, right? But they do, and because of these scholars and the things that they wrote down way back then, and what we look at today, we have scads and just piles of evidence that he rose from the dead. We don't have to guess it. We have proof. Here's just a few things. Now, some of these things, if you're a Grace site or a regular Grace here, you've heard me share some of these before. First, there was an empty tomb. This is big. Everybody in the area, outside of Jerusalem, and in Jerusalem, they all knew where he was buried, or enough of the public knew that he was buried in this place. All of a sudden, nobody's there. The tomb is empty. We could spend all day talking about the implications of that. Everybody knew. It wasn't like the rumors didn't start in another town saying that, did you hear what happened over in Jerusalem? His body disappeared. Those people knew. They were first-hand eyewitnesses. Yep, it happened here. If we're going to start a rumor that he rose from the dead, we would like to start it in another city where people can't go check it out for themselves. Another step, another piece of proof. The tomb was discovered by women. This is both very nice and very sad at the same time. Back then, women weren't allowed to they weren't considered reliable witnesses. They weren't allowed to be witnesses in a court of law. If we were going to start a rumor and say that Jesus rose from the dead, we wouldn't use and I'm saying this somewhat facetiously, we wouldn't use two unreliable people like women to be the witnesses. We would go for men. We would have men start the rumor. We wouldn't have women start the rumor. Now, of course, we've come a long way since then. I think it's a ridiculous thing that women can't be eyewitnesses in a court. But you understand what I'm saying in that story. We would never have used who would be unreliable. We would have gone for the reliable source. And we would have positioned them in a way to spread our rumor for us. But if it was real, we wouldn't have used them. Number 3, generally held belief that the earliest account of the resurrection was written less than 8 years after the fact. Now, the timing is significant. 8 years after the fact, so it was less than. Some people say 6, some people say 7. Less than 8 years after the fact. People are saying, when Jesus rose, I was a witness. So we have first-hand people saying, I saw him. Now, they're not speaking to a myth. It's not like, and I heard from somebody several hundred years ago. They're writing it in present day. And the way that scholars and theologians look at this is they're saying it as it's current news. If we would turn on the news today, we would hear what happened in Syria. Some churches were bombed. It was a terrible terrorist attack. That's current news. That really happened, by the way. It's awful for those folks. And when they wrote of Jesus' resurrection, these people were writing as though it was current news, not a myth. Now, we're looking back 2,000 years. People today say, oh, that's a myth of 2,000 years ago. But if we read the accounts of the people who saw then, they were writing real time. Another one. Many appearances of Jesus after the resurrection. And the appearances were significant. He didn't just show up to one person alone. Imagine this. You're sitting at your dinner table or your dining table and you're sitting all by yourself, and all of a sudden he shows up and you have this great conversation, and then you leave and you say, hey, I just saw Jesus. Sure you did. He showed up with multiple people. At one point, hundreds at one time. He would show up with groups of here, groups there, groups here, groups there, groups here, all around. Not the same house over and over and over again. Not to one person, not to one or two, all kinds of people. Again, in one case of hundreds of people. The witnesses were everywhere. And they were in Jerusalem. It just spread like wildfire. I saw Jesus. I saw Jesus. People outside of Jerusalem, away from Jerusalem. I saw Jesus. I saw Jesus. It's going on like crazy. And again, it's not one person at a time. There's scads of people, and he sits down and he talks. He has conversation with them, which leads us to the next bit of proof. The growth explosion. Now back then they didn't just have they didn't have emails, obviously, they didn't have phone calls. They would share with each other, and they would share, guess who I saw? I saw Jesus. He rose. He really rose. I can't believe that. I saw Jesus. And they say he rose. What we know is, if we go back at that point in time, both in Jerusalem and then in the areas all around Israel, people, as the witnesses are going, saying, I saw, and as Jesus is spreading himself in different parts, saying, here I am, here I am, here I am, people are coming to believe in droves by the thousands. By the thousands. And they held on to their belief so much. Many of them were put to death in terrible ways. They would never agree to be put to death if they wouldn't have saw him. They would never agree to that. They would never say, okay, we're all going to hold on to our fake story and we're all going to be eaten by lions just to make you think that we're right. And the Romans were feeding them to lions. They would have never done that. If we take just these 5 things that I mentioned and we ball them together, that's not just a coincidence. I can go on to other things. There are more and more things I can share. There's all kinds of reasons to believe that he rose. It's a wonderful day. You with me? We know he rose. Not because it feels good. I had dinner yesterday. Do you believe me or does it feel good? Did you have dinner yesterday? I believe you. I don't have to feel good about it. I believe that Jesus rose because of the facts, not because of a feeling. We serve a most wonderful God. And this is the day that gets our attention. This day is different from all other days. Just about everybody here was born. Obviously, we're all born and we're going to die, but Jesus didn't stay dead. So there's 3 things that we're going to look at in the resurrection, 3 things that we can learn from the resurrection. Last week, we looked at some things to learn from the Exodus, and we're going to kind of carry that through 3 things to look at in the resurrection. We won't spend a lot of time, but it's good to call it out today. Again, it's the best day to call it out. So go ahead, Maddie, let's look at this. And I want to give you a bit of a backdrop. Jesus has died. They've taken his body, and he hasn't risen at this point. They've just taken his body. And the next day, on the Sabbath, the leading priests and the Pharisees went to see Pilate. Pilate, of course, the Roman governor in the region. They told him, "Sir, we remember that the deceiver, by the way, they're calling Jesus the deceiver. They're going to Pilate with this story. And they say, we remember that what the deceiver once said while he was still on the cross, or while he's still alive. After 3 days, I will rise from the dead. So we request that you seal the tomb until the 3rd day." See, they remembered, didn't they? They remembered that Jesus said this, and they were going to have none of it. They didn't want anything to happen, so they went to Pilate to say, seal the tomb. And by the way, we could spend a lot of time talking about sealing the tomb. It didn't just mean moving the rock. There actually was a seal process, a big deal to it. So they're saying, we request that you seal the tomb until the 3rd day. This will prevent the disciples from coming and stealing his body and then telling everyone he was raised from the dead. If that happens, we'll be worse off than we were at first. Pilate replied, take guards and secure it the best that you can. So they sealed the tomb and posted guards to protect it. They got their way. They got a lot of support to close off that tomb, make sure no hijinks were going on. They remembered. You with me? Now we're going to read on. Go ahead. But very early on Sunday, so a little time later, very early on Sunday morning, the women, Mary and some of her friends, Salome, went to the tomb taking the spices they had prepared. They found that the stone had been rolled away from the entrance, so they went in, but they didn't find the body of the Lord Jesus. As they stood there puzzled, 2 men suddenly appeared to them, clothed in dazzling robes. These angels, bam, there they are. The women were terrified and bowed with their faces to the ground. Then the men said, why are you looking among the dead for someone who is alive? He isn't here. He has risen from the dead. I love this part. Remember what he told you back in Galilee, that the Son Man must be betrayed into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and that he would rise again on the 3rd day. Go ahead, Maddie. Then they remembered what he said to them. Jesus said, I'm going to die, I'm going to rise. The bad guys remembered it. The good guys didn't remember it. You see it? The Pharisees, the ones who were up to no good, they remembered and they tried to stop them. The ladies, the people, the believers, they didn't even remember that. Our first lesson in the resurrection is God does what he says he's going to do no matter we understand it or not. Bless you. No matter if we understand it or not, he does what he says he's going to do. We don't have to remember. Do you ever forget anything? We don't have to remember. We don't have to understand. He does it anyway. And the resurrection reminds us of that. There may be people who remember and they're trying to get us. Maybe somebody in here, maybe you felt like people are against you. Maybe people are against you. God's going to do what He's going to do regardless. He remembers His promises and He stands by them, whether we understand it or not. And thank God we can't understand all of His promises. Because if we could understand everything God said, then it would make me wonder what kind of God He is. God should know more than me. He should remember more than me. You know what I'm talking about? He's been around for eternity. I hope He knows more than me. That feels pretty good, doesn't it? Having a God that knows more than us. The second lesson in this, or second, I guess, thing to remember from the resurrection, the empty tomb is just one more amazing event that proves the Bible is true. It's just one more thing. And if we had time, if we were sitting around in a living room and we could just talk and schmooze about amazing events that God proves Himself in, after amazing events that God proves Himself in, we could go for some time. But the resurrection is just one more thing. He says He's going to do it, and He does it, and it just proves Himself. Go ahead, Maddie. These are a few verses that talk about the Messiah and leading up to the crucifixion. And they're hundreds of years. They're in the Old Testament. They're not even in the New Covenant. And hundreds of verses talk about the Messiah. Psalm 22, David's prophesying, and he said, he tells that Jesus would be surrounded by those to do evil, that His hands and feet would be pierced. You know, at this time, crucifixion wasn't even a thing. He's describing something that probably was very hard to visualize because they didn't have crucifixion. We could count His bones. Now, I just want to call this out. Hanging in the cross was a particular way, and after sagging, bones would show themselves. Because of the sag, people would, just by nature of the positioning, bones had a way, the ribs, and the chest bone, and bones would show themselves. And they would divide his clothes by casting lots. So here he is, He's on the cross, hundreds of years after this is prophesied, and right at His feet, there's guys gambling over who's going to win his clothes. You know, can I just share a tangent here? I've known teenagers, and I've known people who are older than teenagers, to be very concerned about clothes. And apparently, this isn't the only generation that's ever been concerned about clothes. You know what I mean? Zechariah 12 says He'd be pierced. He'd be pierced. Isaiah 53, there's lots and lots in Isaiah 53, tells us that He'd not be particularly attractive or charismatic. I like the fact that He wasn't one of these guys that had this animal magnetism. He was just a very normal man. Not really good looking. I can't imagine Him being that ugly, but I picture Him as being very normal. Not charismatic in that way. People didn't follow Him for His charisma. They didn't follow Him because He was kind of the Pied Piper of people at that time. He was just a very normal man. That it also tells that He'd be despised and rejected, punished for our peace. The guy did nothing wrong. In fact, He did so much good. He spends His years in ministry, healing people, doing wonderful things, sign after sign, miracle after miracle after miracle. And what do they do for it? They killed Him. You ever felt like you've done something for somebody and they just do bad back to you? I think Jesus went through that. He'd be led like a lamb to slaughter and buried in a rich man's tomb. The guy didn't even have his own grave. And then He'd be wiped out, cut off from the land of the living, and then His days would be prolonged. If you're cut off from the land of living, and then your days are prolonged, that's really something. And that's what happened. So we look at these events and we go, man, just what was described hundreds of years beforehand, Jesus did in fact do. It's amazing to me that more people don't believe in Jesus. I don't think they know this stuff. Isn't He wonderful? I'll tell you, we could go all day long. Again, I mentioned this before, all day long and just talk about how God proved Himself. There's one thing happening right under our nose. It's a current day happening. And I've shared it with people who don't know the Lord. And I'll tell them about this current day thing that's happening, that the Lord's doing. And they almost have the same response. if not always, they do this. Huh. They don't know what to say. So here's what it is. This is what I share. This is a current day happening that God's doing. The rebirth of the land of Israel. You think, well, I don't see, what's the big deal? What country can you imagine, can you think of, that after 2,000 years of not existing, all of a sudden exists? They didn't fight for their land. They didn't band together and take over an area and then say, we're that land again. What country just existed from nothing? What country even reforms after 2,000 years? But in 1948, so Britain had control of the land, and they said they didn't want it anymore, and they went to the United Nations, and they said, the United Nations, do something with it. And the United Nations, they gave it to Israel. For nothing. For nothing. What are the odds of that? You with me? By the way, I just want to correct something that, a little bit of a misnomer. You got in second service, man, I say more stuff. If you ever want a shorter sermon, go to first service. There's a lot of dispute about Palestinians and Jews and whose land it is. And the fact that the United Nations offered it to the Jews in the land, but not the Arabs in the land, and how unfair and how unjust that is. And a lot of people are quite put out at that, people on the world stage. If you want to do something interesting, go back and read the resolutions leading up in the United Nations to the time where they offered the Jews the land. And you'll find that they offered half the land to the Arabs there, and half the land to the Jews there. But the Arabs said no. They said, we want all of it, or we want none of it. We'll take it ourselves. And it is unbelievably well documented. So the United Nations, when they were told no, they said, okay. And the Jews said, we'll take half. We'll take whatever. And when the Arabs said no, the Jews said, well, we'll still take half. And the United Nations said, nah, forget it. You can have the whole thing. And if you don't believe me, just start Googling and take time and read it for yourself. When they got the land, then the wars broke out and all that kind of stuff. So the second thing we remember is that the resurrection is just one more thing that God proves himself in. The third thing that we will call it this morning is this. The empty tomb validates the power of Jesus over death for him and for us. It validates the power. It makes it real. You know, when I was a kid, when I was 19, 20, 21, I think all the way up to I was 23, me and my buddies would get together every Sunday afternoon in the fall, and we would play football. And we would play football together, and we would take on other groups of kids, and we would play anywhere there was a group. And we played against had a lot of guys. We'd play 11 on 11. We played big football games and tackle football. If we were playing against groups that we didn't know, and somebody would come in and just smear me or smear us, we all would do the same thing. Some guy would come out of nowhere and just clobber me. I would get up as fast as I could, and I would look at him and I would say, is that the best you got, little man? I didn't want him to have the satisfaction of thinking that it really hurt me. And all the guys who played football and my buddies, we said the same thing. We didn't want to give them the satisfaction to think that they hurt us. We had to get ready because the next time they would really try to hurt us. It was a pride thing, I guess. This is where Jesus says, hey, death, is that the best you got, little man? You can't stop me. Nothing's going to stop me. Let's look at it. Go ahead, Maddie. 1 Corinthians 15. But in fact, Christ has been risen from the dead. He is the first of a great harvest. The first. It starts with him, and then it comes on, it moves on. First of a great harvest of all who have died. So you see, just as death came into the world through a man, that man is Adam. Thanks a lot, Adam. This is a tangent. Have you ever had anybody do something that affected you badly? You don't do it yourself, they do it, and you go, oh, thanks a lot. That's kind of Adam, that poor guy. But we're all people. People make mistakes. Just as the world, I'll start this part over. Just as death came into the world through a man, now the resurrection from the dead has begun through another man, Jesus. Just as everyone who dies, because we all belong to Adam, Everyone who belongs to Christ will be given new life. But there is an order to this resurrection. Christ was raised as the first of the harvest. So he had to be first. He had to prove it. Then all who belong to Christ will be raised when he comes back. When all who belong to Christ. Do you think that's everybody? Do you think that's the whole world? I've heard people say, the whole world is going to be okay. The whole world's going to go to heaven. I don't think so. I think it's just those who belong to Christ. The whole world's not going to go to heaven. There's some people who don't even like God. Oh, if he's really true, he wouldn't be like, and they say bad things. If somebody says bad things about you, would you say, oh, yeah, I get it. Why don't you stay at my house for the weekend? Is that even common sense? We would never do that. Why would we expect God to do that? People who badmouth God. You badmouth his son. You badmouth my kids. You think I'm going to be all great with you? Why would we think that? God, why would he tolerate that? People who take on Christ, now that's a different deal. You know, one thing that really separates through all of this, I think of the world's religions. And I think what Jesus, how he is so different, what he does in his resurrection is so different than those other world religions. Muhammad is buried in a dome. He's buried. People make pilgrimage. They go to his grave. He said he's going to come back, but how does he prove it? He can't prove that he's going to come back. He's never proved it before. He has no credibility with anybody. People who follow him are doing so on blind faith because he's never come back. What about somebody who believes in reincarnation? How do you know that you'll come back as a bug? Or as a bird? Or as an antelope? How do you know you'll be a fish? Prove it. They can't prove it. Jesus proves it. I'm getting up again. And as I got up, then you're going to get up. He actually proved it. This is good, yeah? He is different than any other world. He's the only one to prove it. And because he proved it, we can get it as we belong to him. And that's the catch. Who belongs to him? Who belongs to Christ? Again, I don't think it's everybody in the world. I think it's people who take him on. And it's people who say, you know what, Jesus, what you live for, you rose from the dead, you got my attention, and what you live for, I'm going to live for. And I'm going to make you my Lord. I'm going to live for you. Those are the people who belong to Christ, the people who live for him. They're his. And his alone. Are you with me? I don't know if everybody in here, I don't know if you've all had the opportunity to make that statement and declare yourself to follow him. Resurrection is for everybody who follows him. This morning, I want to give you the chance. Now, there's two ways I'm going to give it to you. The first way is the bold way. I'm going to ask to see your hand in just a minute. You ready? You want to give yourself to him? I want to help you. There's no tricks. I don't need your checkbook. I just need you to be willing. I'll show you how to do it. It's very easy. So who is it? Right on. What I want to do afterward, if there's going to be a couple of us, I'm going to come find you. Yeah? Mark, we've got another pastor who'll be here. I'll come find you, and then I'll go back to you two. And this young lady in the back, Mark, please wave your hand. Look for that guy. Okay? We're going to do it together. We're just going to pray together. It's all we're going to do. And introduce yourself to somebody here. It's not hard. Now, if you didn't raise your hand and you want to get in on it, come find me or go ahead, Mark. Come find the hand wave. Find that guy. He's going to be talking to other people. We're going to be talking to them just what you're interested in. Giving your life to the Lord. Being sure that you're one of Christ's. Being sure that you're in the afterlife with him. He proved himself. This is a good day to take him on. Amen? So if you would, please stand up and we'll pray. I love this day. Lord, I thank you very much for this house. I thank you for bringing us all together. Jesus, thank you for defying death. Thank you for making that way for me. Thank you for making that way for all of us, Lord, as we come to you. Lord, I pray for blessings on everybody here, Lord, as we look to understand more of you. We've got a whole life journey ahead of us, God, but we're looking to you to lead us and to guide us, and please show us the way. I pray for good days for everybody today. And on this special day to remember. Thank you, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May he lift up his countenance on you and give you peace. And I got to tell you, I can't think of any more peace than knowing that I'm with him forever. Forever. Can you think of a greater peace? Our days may be bad, but we got him. We got him. Amen. So please